When it comes to digital to analog conversion, that is converting a digital audio signal to an analog one for amplification in our systems, I think most people will have heard of Topping and Schiit audio. Topping, which has a name sounding like a condiment, and Schiit audio, which has a name sounding like, oh, well, let's not go there. But jokes aside, the D70 Pro Octo, I reckon, is a screaming bargain at the moment because both of these DACs are strong competitors in the $500 to $1,000 segment. But the D70 Pro Octo has dropped below the $500 mark, going down from its $599 original price down to under $450, which I reckon makes it a screaming bargain because in comparing them, I think they sound equally as good with only some very subtle differences. But otherwise, they could not be more different in the aims of their designs. The Topping D70 Pro Octo, like a lot of Topping DACs, has an absolute slew of features, including a remote control that allows you to adjust everything from the inputs to whether it's outputting from the XLR balance sockets or the RCA sockets or both. It has a 12-volt trigger input if you want to hook all your devices together to have them power on at the same time by pressing one power button. And you can even control things like whether the button on the outside knob, pressing that in, either mutes or changes the display or changes the input or a bunch of other stuff. And there's a whole lot more that I won't go into. So, whereas the Bifrost is like, you have an input and a basic remote control with mute on it, and you can set it into non-oversampling mode if you so desire. It doesn't even do super high res input, only going up to 192 kilohertz, but it does have a high quality USB input which can be switched out, and also the DACs so that it can be upgraded. That means you don't have to buy a whole new DAC if you wish to upgrade it. However, in the future, the Bifrost may get the fork-beard system, and currently the 264 cannot just simply be adapted to fork-beard without, well, basically replacing the whole DAC to begin with. So maybe that ship has sailed. And that means that at a few $100s cheaper than the Bifrost, the Topping D70 Pro Octo is a screaming bargain. Now, in comparing both of these DACs, I plug them basically blind in with the same cables into my Audio GD Master 10 amp, and then actually use that to a pair of Hi-Fi Man Susvaras directly, which is a very good way of evaluating DACs, I find, and I find I can make out the subtle differences between them quite easily, depending on the quality of music I have. Now, I tend to listen to, most of the time, fairly good quality music such as Natalie Merchant or Kamsai Washington, or other music where there's a good balance of instruments, vocals, and less so digital instruments, and mainly acoustic ones. That can stretch into jazz and classical at times as well. And what I find is that the reason people are attracted to R2R DACs, such as the Bifrost and the Fio Warmer, which I recently reviewed, is because their way they present music feels more natural than it does with a Sigma Delta DAC, basically ones from Cirrus Logic or ESS Tech or the like. However, I was quite surprised when I compared these blind that the differences between them were subtle. When I listened to the DAC plugged into input 1, with both using their USB inputs, I found that the DAC in input 1 sounded maybe a touch thinner, and maybe the DAC in input 2 maybe sounding a touch fuller, and maybe a fraction more detailed. But I found that the DAC using input 2 was maybe had a presentation which was a touch flatter, whereas the presentation from the one on input 1 was a bit deeper. Now, switching from USB to SPDIF from actually a good digital to digital converter did narrow down the differences between them. And I did this because I wanted to see how good the USB inputs were. If you're going directly from a computer, one of the advantages of having a Schiit audio DAC is the Unison USB system, for the most part, eliminates the issues of noise and interference that cause sound degradation through a USB input in a DAC, whereas Topping doesn't seem to have any kind of isolation at all. And so a poor USB source can make the DAC sound a little bit harsh and edgy, something I tended to find with DACs in general, and something that does not show up in analyzers, because analyzers have their own USB outputs, which is probably much better quality and was dedicated for the purpose. But with computers outputting all sorts of noise over the power lines, especially, that can cause some issues. And as a general rule, incidentally, if you are switching stuff around, such as power or USB and the like, and you want to not quite sure which result is better, the darker sounding one tends to be better, as brightness may sound, oh, this sounds clearer, but actually you may well be hearing more noise. But aside from that, after comparing both the DACs, listening to some good quality music, and finding that maybe the one going to input 2 sounded a little bit fuller and sometimes maybe more engaging for me when listening to tracks that I really liked versus the one plugged into input 1, which sounded maybe a touch more open and maybe a touch less clear. Yeah, well, then I was surprised which was which. Now, an interesting factor about both these DACs is you can turn on the topping and it will sound just the same as when you first switched it on as if you've been leaving it switched on for many hours. However, due to the R2R DACs in the Bifrost 2, it, especially when you've just purchased it, will not quite sound as good as it will after you've left it on about a week. And if you think this is a little bit crazy, well, resistors are actually temperature sensitive. That is, if they're cold versus if they're warm, they will have slightly different resistance. And considering that an R2R DAC does use essentially a ladder of dozens of resistors, that means that the sound can change depending on the temperature the DAC has reached. So after its initial run-in, whether you believe in that or not, you may have to leave it on a few hours before it sounds good. And if you wake up on a cold winter morning and I switch both of these DACs on, well, the topping sounds better. However, if I've left the Bifrost 2 on continuously for many hours first, and then compare them, then it becomes a much closer contest. So, which was which? When I checked, I found that the Bifrost was actually plugged into input 1, and the Topping D70 Pro Octo into input 2. That's unusual. I don't usually find regular Sigma Delta based DACs to sound more musical than something that's R2R, but if there's anything I've learned recently, it's that sometimes R2R DACs don't necessarily mean warm, unless you put them in non-oversampling mode, something you can do with the Bifrost 2, but can actually mean sounding a little bit thinner and clearer, and which is something very apparent with something like the DCS Lena system, which is just out of shot, where it doesn't sound at all warm, as one might expect, but actually very clear. If anything, it was the Topping D70 Pro Octo that wins out on sounding warm and engaging when listening, which was something of a surprise to me, though I probably still found it a touch, maybe what I call flat sounding, where it doesn't have quite as much depth in how it presents music like R2R DACs can do. So of course, while DACs such as the D70 Pro Octo have been pushed to the wayside by newer models coming out as these companies churn out models as fast as they possibly can to build on hype and more hype with improvements and changes, the D70 Pro Octo has dropped considerably in price. My only caution is, if you buy something like a Schiit audio product, if you need help with it years down the track, you probably still can get help. Whereas I'm not quite so confident about the long-term viability of owning something like D70 Pro Octo, and that's coming from a background of buying hi-fi equipment, or my parents buying hi-fi equipment, when I was young and keeping it for many years. I have seen mixed impressions online about the long-term viability of the topping products. But at least as far as a new product goes, I really like how the D70 Pro Octo presents music in a way that is more like what you would expect something like a more musically engaging DAC to be. And especially if you're looking for something like a topping DAC with all its features, but are not really interested in the flat and maybe sometimes edgy sound of the ESS based ones, well, the D70 Pro Octo might be for you. Anyway, thanks to APOS Audio for sending me one of these, and also thank you to all my patrons for supporting me. If you'd like to get my impressions of gear early, do become a patron, and I'll also happily help you out with making sure you choose the right gear for your system, which could end up saving you a lot of money and a lot of unnecessary mistakes. So as always, thanks once again for watching, and I look forward to chatting with you online or at a Can Jam.